Welcome to your Templeton Performing Arts Center in North County TheaterWorks production of Trifles by Susan Glaspell. Please take the time now to silence and stow away all electronic devices. Also, no flash photography or videotaping is allowed. Remember, neither food nor drink is allowed in the theater. Restrooms are located in the lobby. Please note the exits closest to you. This show has no intermission. You are invited to remain in your seats after the show for a short talkback with the actors and director. Thank you for supporting live theater at the TPAC. Enjoy the show.
This feels good. Come to the fire, ladies.
I'm not cold.
Now, Mr. Hale, before I move things about, you tell Mr. Henderson just what you saw when you came here yesterday morning.
By the way, has anything been moved? Are things just as you left them?
It's all the same. Last night when it dropped below freezing, I thought I'd send Frank out this morning to light us a fire. I told him not to touch anything, and you know Frank.
Somebody should have been left here yesterday.
Oh, yesterday, when I had to send Frank down to Morris Center for that man who went crazy. I want you to know I had my hands full yesterday. I knew you could get down here from Omaha by today, so as long as I went over everything myself...
Well, Mr. Hale, tell now just what happened when you came to the house.
Harry and I started to town with a load of potatoes. We came along the road from my place, and when I got here, I said, I'm going to see if I can't get John Wright to go in with me on a party telephone. I spoke to Wright about it once before, and he put me off, saying folks talk too much anyway, and all he asked was peace and quiet. I guess you know about how much he talked himself. But I thought, maybe if I came to the house and talked about it before his wife, though I told Harry I didn't see as to what his wife wanted.
Let's talk about that a little later. I do want to talk about that, but please, Mr. Hale, go on when you came to the house.
Well, I didn't hear or see anything. I knocked at the door, and still it was all quiet inside. I knew they ought to be up. It was past 8 o'clock, so I knocked again. I thought I heard someone say, "Come in." I wasn't sure. I'm not sure now. But I opened the door. That door. And here in this rocker sat Mrs. Wright.
What was she doing?
She was rocking. She back and forth. She had her apron in her hands, and she was sort of pleating at it.
How'd she look?
Well, she looked queer.
How do you mean queer?
Well, as if she didn't know what she was going to do next. You know, sort of done up.
How'd she feel about your coming?
Well, I don't think she minded one way or other. She wasn't paying much attention. I said, "How do, Mrs. Wright? It's cold, ain't it?" And she said, "Is it?" And just went on pleating at her apron. Well, I was surprised. She didn't ask me to come up to the stove or to sit down. She just sat there, not even looking at me. So I said, "I want to see John." And she laughed. I guess you could call it a laugh. Well, I thought about Harry and the team outside, so I said a little sharp, "Can't I see John?" She said, "No, kind of dull-like." "Ain't he home?" says I. "Yes, he's home." "Then why can't I see him?" says I, out of patience. "'Cause he's dead," says she. "Dead," says I. And she just nodded her head, not getting a bit excited, just rocking back and forth. "Where is he?" says I, not knowing what to say. She just pointed upstairs like that. I got up with the idea of going up there, and I walked from, basically there to about here. And I said, "How did he die?" And she said, "He died of a rope around his neck." Well, I went outside and called Harry. I felt I'd probably need some help, so we went upstairs, and there he was, lying.
I think I'd rather have you go into that upstairs. Just tell now and go on with the rest of your story.
Well, the first thing I thought of was to get that rope off. It looked, but Harry, he went right up to him and he said, "No, he's dead all right, and we better not touch anything." So we came back down the stairs, and she was still sitting there in that same way. "Has anyone been notified?" I asked. "No," she says, unconcerned. "Who did this, Mrs. Hale?" said Harry. Harry said it businesslike, and she stopped pleating at her apron. "I don't know," says she. "You don't know?" says Harry. "No," says she. "Weren't you sleeping in bed with him?" says Harry. "Yes," says she, "but I was on the inside. Someone slipped a rope around his neck and strangled him. And you didn't wake up?" "I didn't wake up," says she. "Well, it must have looked as if we didn't see how that could be, because after a minute she says, 'I sleep sound.'" Harry wanted to ask her more questions, but I said, maybe we ought to wait and let her tell her story first to the coroner or to the sheriff. So Harry went out, went as fast as he could down to the Rivers place where there's a telephone.
What did Mrs. Wright do when she knew you'd gone for the coroner?
She walked from that chair and sat in this one. And she just sat there. She had her hands together, looking down. I felt I ought to make some conversation, so I said, "I came by to see if John wanted to put in a telephone." And at that, she started laughing. And then she stopped and looked at me, scared. Maybe it wasn't scared. I wouldn't like to say that it was. But then Harry came back, and then Dr. Lloyd came, and then you, Mr. Peters, and well, I guess that's all I know that you don't.
Well, I guess we'd like to start upstairs, then out to the barn. Are you sure there's nothing here that points to any motive?
Nothing here but kitchen things.
Here's a nice mess.
Oh, her fruit. It did freeze. She was worried about that when it turned so cold. She said the fire would go out and the jars would break.
Can you beat the women? Held for murder and worrying about her preserves.
Well, I guess before we're through, she'll have something more serious about than her preserves.
Well, women do seem to worry about their trifles.
To be sure, and yet, what would we do without the ladies? Dirty towels. Not much of a housekeeper, should I say, ladies?
There's a great deal of work to be done on a farm.
To be sure, and yet, I know there's some Dixon County farmhouses that do not have such roller towels.
Those towels get dirty awful quick, and men's hands aren't always as clean as they might be.
Loyal to your sex, I see. But you and Mrs. Wright were neighbors. I suppose you're friends, too.
I haven't seen much of her of late. I've not been in this house. It's more than a year.
And why is that? You didn't like her?
I liked her all well enough. Farmers' wives have their hands full, Mr. Henderson, and, well,
Yes?
this never was a very cheerful place.
No, it's not cheerful. I shouldn't say she had the homemaking instinct.
Well, I don't know as Wright had either.
You mean that they didn't get on very well?
I don't mean anything. But I don't think a place would be any more cheerful just for having John Wright in it.
Let's talk about that a little later. I'd like to get the lay of things upstairs now.
I suppose anything Mrs. Peters does will be all right. She was to get some clothes for her, and a few little things. We left in such a hurry yesterday.
I'd like to see what you take, Miss Peters, and keep an eye out for anything that may be used to us.
Yes, Mr. Henderson.
I'd hate to have men in my kitchen, snooping around and criticizing.
Of course, it's no more than their duty.
Duty's all right, but I think that deputy sheriff that came in to make the fire could have got some of that on. Wish I'd thought of that sooner. Seems mean to talk about her for not having the place slicked up when she had to come away in such a hurry.
She had a bread set.
Oh. She was going to put this here. Oh, what a shame about her fruit. I wonder if it's all gone. I think there's some here, Mrs. Peters. Yes. And look, it's cherries, too. Oh, but I declare it's the only one. Oh, she'll feel awful bad after all her hard work in the hot weather. Why, I remember the afternoon I put up my cherries last summer.
Well, I must get those things from the front room closet. Are you coming with me, Mrs. Hale? You can help me carry them. My, it's cold in there.
Wright was close. I think maybe that's why she kept so much to herself. She didn't even belong to the Ladies' Aid. Oh, maybe she felt like she couldn't do her part. You don't enjoy things when you feel shabby. She used to wear such pretty things and be lively when she was Minnie Foster, one of the town girls singing in the choir. Oh, but that was 30 years ago. This all you was to take in?
She said she wanted an apron. A funny thing to want, for I don't think there's much to get you dirty in jail, goodness knows. But I suppose to make her feel more natural. She said it was in the top drawer of this cupboard. Yes, here. And then her little shawl that always hung behind the door. Yes, here it is.
Mrs. Peters,
Yes, Mrs. Hale?
do you think she did it?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, I don't think she did. Asking for her apron and her little shawl, worrying about her fruit.
Mr. Peters says it looks bad for her. Mr. Henderson is awful sarcastic in speech, and he'll make fun of her for saying she didn't wake up.
I suppose John Wright didn't wake when they were slipping that rope underneath his neck.
No, it's strange. They say it's such a funny way to kill a man, rigging it all up like that.
That's just what Mr. Hale said. He said there's a gun in the house. That's what he can't understand.
Mr. Henderson said, coming out, that what was needed for this case was a motive. Something to show anger or sudden feeling.
Well, don't see any signs of anger around here. Swipe it to here. I wonder how they're finding things upstairs. I hope she had it a little more read up there. I don't know, it seems so sneaking. Locking her up in town and then coming out here and trying to get her own house to turn against her.
But, Mrs. Hale, the law is the law.
Suppose it is. Better loosen your things, Mrs. Peters. You won't feel them when you go out.
Oh, she was piecing a quilt.
Oh. Oh, it's log cabin pattern. Oh, isn't it pretty? Oh, I wonder if she was going to quilt it or just knot it.
They wonder if she was going to quilt it or just knot it.
Frank's fire didn't do much up there, did it? Let's head out to the barn and get that cleared up.
I don't see as it's strange. Us taking up our time with little things while we're waiting for them to get the evidence. I don't see as it's anything to laugh about.
Of course, they've got awful important things in their minds.
Look at this, Mrs. Peters. Look, this is the one she was working on. And look at the sewing. All the rest has been so neat and even, but look at this. It's all over the place. Why, it looks like she didn't know what she was about.
Oh, what are you doing, Mrs. Hale?
Oh, just pulling out some of the stitches that aren't sewed so good. Bad sewing always made me fidgety.
I don't think we ought to touch things.
I'll just finish up this end. Mrs. Peters,
Yes, Mrs. Hale?
what do you suppose she was so nervous about?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know if she was nervous. I sometimes so awful queer when I'm just tired. Well, I must get those things wrapped up. I wonder where I can find a piece of paper and string.
Maybe in that cupboard over there.
Why, here's a bird cage. Did she have a bird, Mrs. Hale?
I don't know if she did or not. I've not been here in so long. You know, there was a fellow around here last year selling canaries. Cheap. But I don't know if she took one. Maybe she did.
It seems funny to think of a bird here, but she must have had one, or else why would she have the cage? I wonder what happened to it.
I suppose the cat got it.
No, she doesn't have a cat. She's got that feeling some people have about cats, being afraid of them. My cat got into her room and she was real upset and asked me to take it out.
My sister Bessie was like that. Queer, ain't it?
Why, look at this door. It's broke. One hinge is pulled apart.
Why, it looks like someone's been rough with it.
Why, yes.
I wish if they'd be finding any evidence, they'd be about it. I don't like this place.
Of course, I'm awful glad you came with me, Mrs. Hale. It would be lonesome for me sitting here alone.
It would, wouldn't it? But I tell you what I do wish, Mrs. Peters. I wish I'd come over sometimes when she was here. I wish I had.
Of course, you were awful busy with your house and your children.
I could have come. I stayed away because it weren't cheerful. And that is why I ought to have come. I've never liked this place. Maybe because it's down in a hollow and you can't see the road. I don't know, but it's a lonesome place, and it always was. Oh, I wish I'd come to see Minnie Foster sometimes. I can see now.
But you mustn't reproach yourself. Somehow we don't see how it is with other folks until something comes up.
Not having children makes for less work, but it makes for a quiet house. With Wright out to work all day, and no company when he did come in. Did you know John Wright, Mrs. Peters?
Not to know him. I've seen him in town. They say he was a good man.
Yes, good. He didn't drink, He kept his word as well as most, and he paid his debts, but he was a hard man, Mrs. Peters. Just to pass the time of day with him, he was like a raw wind that cuts to the bone. I should think she would have wanted a bird. But what do you suppose went with it?
I don't know, unless it got sick and died.
You aren't from around here? You weren't raised here? You didn't know her?
Not till they brought her yesterday.
Now come to think of it, she was like a bird herself. Real sweet and pretty, but also kind of timid and fluttery. How she did change. But tell you what, Mrs. Peters, why don't you take the quilt in with you? It might take up her mind.
Why, I think that's a real nice idea, Mrs. Hale. There couldn't be any objection now to... Could there? Now, just what would I take? I wonder if her patches were in here, and her things.
Well, here's some red, and, well, maybe this has her sewing things in it. What a pretty box. Looks like something somebody would give you. Maybe her scissors are in here. Oh, Mrs. Peters, there's something wrapped up in this piece of silk.
Why, this isn't her scissors.
Oh, Mrs. Peters, it's
the bird.
Oh, Mrs. Peters, look at it. Its neck, look at its neck. It's all other side, too.
Somebody wrung its neck.
Say, ladies, have you figured out if she's gonna quilt it or knot it?
We think she was going to knot it.
Well, that's interesting, I'm sure. Has the bird flown?
We think the cat got it.
Is there a cat?
Well, not now. They're superstitious, you know. They leave.
No sign of anyone coming from the outside. They're on road. Let's go upstairs and get that figured out. It would have had to have been someone that just knew.
She liked the bird. She was going to bury it in this pretty box.
When I was a girl, my kitten, there was a boy, took a hatchet and right before my eyes, and before I could get there, if they hadn't held me back, I would have hurt him.
I wonder how it would seem never to have had any children. No, Wright wouldn't have wanted a bird, a thing that sang. She used to sing, and he killed that too.
We don't know who killed the bird.
I knew John Wright.
It was an awful thing that was done in this house that night, Mrs. Hale. Killing a man while he slept, slipping a rope around his neck that choked the life out of him.
His neck choked the life out of him.
We don't know who killed him. We don't know.
If there'd been years and years of nothing, and then a bird to sing to you, oh, it would be awful still after the bird was still.
I know what stillness is. When we homesteaded in Dakota and my first baby died after he was 2 years old and me with no other then.
How soon do you think they'll be through looking for the evidence?
I know what stillness is. The law has got to punish crime, Mrs. Hale.
I wish you'd seen Minnie Foster when she wore a white dress with blue ribbons and she stood up there in the choir and sang. Oh, I wish I'd come over here once in a while. That was a crime. That was a crime. Who's going to punish that?
We mustn't take on.
I might have known she needed help. I know how it can be for other women. I tell you, it's queer, Mrs. Peters. We live close together and we live far apart. We all go through the same things. It's just a different kind of the same thing. If I were you, I wouldn't tell her fruit was gone. Tell her it ain't. Tell her it's all right. Take that in to prove it to her. She may never know whether it was broke or not.
It's a good thing the men couldn't hear us. Why did they just laugh, getting all worked up over a little thing like a dead canary, as if that could have anything to do with, oh, wouldn't they just laugh?
Maybe they would. But maybe they wouldn't.
No, Peters, it's perfectly clear except for a reason for doing it. But you know the juries when it comes to the woman. If there's some definite thing, something to show, something to make a story about. A thing that would connect it with this strange way of doing it.
I brought the team around. It's cold out there.
I'm going to stay here a while by myself. You can send Frank out for me, can't you? I want to go over everything. I'm not satisfied that we can't do better.
Do you want to see what Mrs. Peters is going to take?
Well, I guess it's not very dangerous things ladies have picked out. No, Mrs. Peters doesn't need supervising. For that matter, a sheriff's wife is married to the law. Ever think of it that way, Mrs. Peters?
Not just that way.
Married to the law. I just want you to come in here a minute, George. We ought to take a look at these windows.
Oh, windows.
We'll be right out, Mr. Hill.
Well, Henry, at least we figured out she was not going to quote it. What do you call it, ladies?
We call it not it, Mr. Henderson.